Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 o'clock. If I get here, we talk about whatever I want to talk about because I paid. And that's the way it works in radio. I don't know if you know it. You know, Evan's got he gets paid, so that's his. He actually is talent. That's the difference between what he does and what I do. He's actually talent. He gets paid. I'm actually an advertiser. I pay to sit here and talk to you guys. Can you believe that? And that's it's just crazy. But and that's why Evan's show is good and mine is being paid for. So anyway, that's the way it goes here at WSTU. So what has happened for those that are new listeners is that you got stuck on the wrong channel. So just hang in there, though. Sometimes something good comes out of this show. Not very often, and I think we've got it recorded if it ever did. So it's all good from that standpoint. You can join us live on WSTU1450.com. And that is where you can pick up a lot of the shows. There's they save them for not every show and not for forever and ever. I think a number of my shows, they go in the can, so to speak, and then they go in the can, so to speak. They're pretty much gone right afterwards. They try to get rid of those. But in general, you can log on and pick up something. If there was something said that you want to then call me and criticize me on, that's good. You can do that. You can hold it against me, whatever. But just remember, I'm paying for the show, not you, so I get to be right. That's the way it works here. And that's the other thing that I need to make sure that very clear on the understanding of the show is that when you say something on the radio, it is absolutely true. It's not true if I say it on the internet, but if I do say it on the radio, then it is true. So you can take that to the bank. So so for the next hour, I'm going to make stuff up, and you got to, kind of just hang in there and hope that it's not too outrageous. But in all seriousness, if you've got a comment about something, as long as it's not too abusive, 220-9788, 220-WSTU is the number in the studio. Write that number down because that's the number for a lot of things at WSTU. That's their main number, and you can get in on a lot of the other shows that WSTU has and comment sometimes or ask questions or just get information. And that's the good thing about WSTU. It's good for information. And then speaking of that, but it's not really part of the show normally, but I would mention just for those of you that are planning on heading into Stuart today and didn't happen to catch, maybe you're just on the road now, didn't happen to catch Evan and Bonnie's show this morning, the Roosevelt Bridge. I can't believe this because I was here when they actually built this. It wasn't that long ago. The new Roosevelt Bridge, as it's fondly known, the south side of that, the southbound lanes of the new Roosevelt Bridge are apparently falling into the water. There are chunks of concrete falling out, which is amazing. So it's closed. Now, the north side is 100% good to go. They were installed at the same time from the same company in the same delivery, but it's 100% good to go. At least no chunks are falling off of it yet. So what you've got is a situation where if you're coming to Stuart over the Roosevelt Bridge, you could go straight, and then you're going to be funneled in from a gazillion lanes of traffic up by the mall into one lane of traffic as you get to the bridge. And then that one lane will then change sides and you'll go southbound on the northbound lanes. And they have cones up and a divider so that people can't, hopefully run into each other. And then the northbound is being funneled from 4 or 5 lanes down by Colorado into one lane going northbound. And so for those of you that are old timers, we can now use the excuse, I got stuck by the Roosevelt Bridge. So that's a good one today. It hasn't been valid since the since they put in the new bridge, because you couldn't argue the drawbridge concept. Remember in the day when you were late for work, you always could just say, I got stuck by the drawbridge, and I got stuck at the Roosevelt Bridge. And that was good for at least 20 minutes late. If you were 20 minutes or less late, you usually could get that to cover. Now, today, for those of you that are running a little late for the office, you got stuck by the new Roosevelt Bridge, and you can be up to about 45 minutes to an hour late, because that's about how long it's taking to reroute yourself, either to wait in traffic and sit there as you kind of inch along, or you can reroute yourself to Hutchinson Island, basically, or to Sewell's Point and come through that way. I'm sure that the Sewell's Point police really appreciate that. But anyway, that's the way you have to get to downtown Stuart right now, and that's why. Now you say, well, why not? Why don't I go over the old bridge? The old bridge is closed. And I was wondering, what the heck? Why is the old bridge closed? Well, I guess because they're afraid, because the old bridge and the road to the old bridge, not the old bridge itself, but the road to the old bridge goes under the new bridge, where pieces are falling off. So they're a little bit worried that the pieces will fall off onto the cars that are trying to go over the old Roosevelt Bridge, which is kind of interesting. So what I don't understand is, isn't there a way that they can take you across Wright Boulevard into North River Shores and then wrap you back around, and come out past where the bridge crosses the road, down by where the deck is, or in that area, you're past the bridge area. So I don't understand why they don't just reroute traffic that way. I know it would be an inconvenience on that neighborhood, but it's sure a lot shorter than going all the way back down Savannah Road into Indian River Drive and through Sewell's Point and coming back over that way. But anyway, so those of you that are out there, that is the situation that's going on. So, plan on that today, because it doesn't look like it's going to be an immediate change. I gather, I guess, that they're bringing in engineers to take a look and see whether, really this is just a minor problem, only small chunks, or if it's a major problem, the southbound lane is actually going to fall down, which would be kind of weird and dangerous for those people who live under that. There's some businesses on that side that are very, very close to that. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But anyway, that's what's going on from a traffic perspective. Yeah, as a little side note, bringing it back to the economic nature of this show, because this is what Treasure Coast Solutions is about, is really kind of talking about local issues, mostly financial and economic issues, and how that relates, and what effect it has on us locally, and if we have national issues, what effect that they have on us. And so we're pulling that back a little bit. It's interesting that the only bridge that really is not a problem, it was the bridge that was built during the Roosevelt era as a work project. So that one I think is still standing pretty strong. I think even the one that was built in the 70s is the one that they ended up taking down. So I think the old one is, maybe still there. I don't remember which is which span was which. But anyway, the old Roosevelt Bridge isn't a problem. I want to give some of the people from Main Street back in the day, Joan Jefferson and some of the people there, and the city at the time, that fought very hard to not let the Florida Department of Transportation tear down the old bridge. Those that were here remember that originally they wanted to tear that bridge down because the new one was going to replace it, and so they didn't want to leave the old one there. And many people talked them into keeping it because they felt like it would have a major impact on the downtown, and it actually would have. If that hadn't been maintained, basically you would have a flyby. There would have, and originally they weren't even going to stop at Joan Jefferson, which was Second Street at the time, I think. But anyway, so what they were going to do is, the bridge actually would land beyond Joan Jefferson. So you would have to go all the way up to Colorado and backtrack downtown to get downtown the way that the bridge was originally designed. And then they were getting rid of the the drawbridge, and so you would have had to go all the way up around to Colorado, and had only really one entrance to downtown. And so, thanks to some visionary type thought process, they managed to save that. Some of the citizens of Stewart managed to save that, and I think we're all glad of that. Now, it's glad that was done, and the city is economically, it's been a big boost to the city, because it's made it a very viable option. And of course, now the new Roosevelt Bridge, they also got it to land prior to prior to the Joan Jefferson. Of course, the south side of the bridge at that area, I think, is where there's a problem. So I guess I don't know, but anyway, so that's what's going on there. But from an economic standpoint on these issues, I kind of wanted to go in a little bit of that, as to what's going on with some of the other things that are happening, particularly some of the issues that are going on from the school standpoint. And so, I'll just mention, my name is Mark Brackbill. I'm a CPA, ex-banker, have been involved in finance for a long time, and I have my own CPA firm here in town, which we do a lot of business planning, as well as we do some individual planning and financial issues, and we do audit work and that kind of thing, those kind of things. So I've had an opportunity, and I do really consider it an opportunity, to be in the financial industry for a long time. And the stint that I spent in public accounting when I first got out of college was in public accounting, but it was dealing with banks, and it was really large banks. I got an opportunity to be involved with some of the larger financial companies and banks in the world at the time. First Chicago, which was a huge bank, Harris Bank, Northern Trust, American National Bank, Heller, which was the parent for Walter Heller, which is the parent for American National Bank, which was one of the larger finance companies and factoring companies in the world at the time. Billions of assets, which was unusual back then. So it was really, really interesting to have that kind of perspective. And of course, in the banking industry, my major was accounting, a lot, but in the banking industry, a lot of economists, a lot of loan officers were economists or had an economics background, and finance or economics, but a lot of economics in the upper management. And it's it's needed. You have to understand how things work. The good thing about being involved in the banking industry, whether it was either local banks or the large money center banks, is that you were on the cutting edge, and in many cases the bleeding edge of a lot of innovation, a lot of things that were taking place. You had to figure out how to handle it because it was the first time it had been done. And I'm talking things like rate swaps and hedging with financial futures, and a lot of things like that that grew up in the financial industry and was incubated in the banking system and became part of the mainstream. And that's that's what happens. And in the banking industry, they're paid. They don't sometimes understand this, but they're actually paid for taking risk. If you're running a bank with no losses on your loans, you are messing up, because that's not the way it's done. The system anticipates a certain percentage of losses. If those losses become too large, there's a problem. Unless the losses are caused by some extraneous activity that you really don't have any control over, which happens to everybody. It happens to any business. And that's, one of the problems with banks right now is they would be in that situation if they weren't making a bunch of loans now for the government. So anyway, that's, it's been an interesting process and a learning process. But what I wanted to draw on now is what's going on economically. We've heard some information, about, we've had some reopening, and of course there's more testing and there's more cases, and you can get into a big argument on that as to, what came first, the chicken or the egg. And that's really all it is. There's no answer to that, because it's a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. So, I would encourage you, as as a numbers guy, I would encourage you to look at the deaths and the death rate. That's what really counts in any pandemic. If people just get sick and they all recover, it's really not a pandemic. If on the other hand, people get sick and they die, and a lot of people die, then it is really a problem. So we need to keep an eye on that number for deaths. Frankly, right now it's hard to tell whether an increase in cases may actually be a good thing, because one of the things that I've been talking about for the last 3 months on the show, and started talking about early on, was looking at the statistics and also taking into consideration that many people don't really like numbers. And I know I've got a lot of friends and a lot of people I deal with that the reason they deal with me is that they don't like numbers, and they would rather have me deal with those numbers, whether it's taxes or audits or financial statements or accounting or whatever the number may be. And a lot of people don't like it. The other thing that people don't realize is that accountants are really, especially CPAs, are not necessarily really good mathematicians. I will tell you that geometry was my worst class ever in anything across the board. It was the lowest grade I ever got in high school was in geometry. You don't have to be a wizard to be able to be a CPA, a math wizard. You just have to be able to understand and think about what the numbers are and what they mean. And you have to be, it's a lot of what I do on the tax side is more legal than it is, and in some of my clients' cases, I guess probably more illegal, but hopefully that's not too often, but legal more than it is numbers and accounting. It's more a question of understanding the law, what you can do and can't do, and what goes on. So it's an interesting thing that, but what we've been talking about on the show is this concept of flattening the curve. And I want to go back to that because it's important to stay focused on that. Because what we were talking about at the day is that, a lot of people didn't understand the math. So when they saw the curve and they saw this big hump that looked like a camel curve, and that was what we were trying to avoid, and that was what we were trying to flatten. So we were taking this big, what I would, in the language of math, is kind of referred to as a bell curve. You know what a bell curve is? Well, it looks like a bell, right? But a bell curve is a curve where the data is equally distributed underneath the curve from the standpoint of it. There's a high point and then all the way down to the low percentages on both outside ends of it. So what you've done is you've taken all of the area under that curve, and you measure that area, but it's all shaped like a bell. All right. And I remember when you look at statistics, a bell curve is an equal distribution. So for people that have remember the phrase, my professor grades on the curve, or my teacher grades on the curve, what they mean is they use a bell curve distribution. So they take the data, whatever that data is. If your score was 75 on a score that's 100, it's your score is 75, but that 75 is the highest grade in the class. That becomes in the top percentage of the bell curve. It becomes in the portion on the right down near the bottom, which is the highest portion of the data. And if you are a 23 out of 100, then you're on the other side of the bell curve, on the bottom side. And so basically you'd have a certain percentages of A's, a bigger percentage of B's, a large percentage of C's, a smaller percentage of D's, no E's, and then a smaller percentage of F's. So basically you'd have as many B's as D's, you'd have as many A's as F's, you'd have the rest would all be C's. That's the distribution of a bell curve. Now you say, why am I talking about this? Because this is exactly what they were talking about when they were talking about flattening the curve. What they were talking about is a redistribution of that data, not from an equal distribution where there's an equal number in one side of A's and F's and D's and B's, not that kind of distribution, but rather a distribution where there's a lot more C's that are flat, and all of the A's, B's, and D's and F's are small and spread out. Okay, so the same number of total data, but what we've done is taking it so that it's not a bell curve, so there's not this huge amount at the top and then it drops off sharply, but rather that we're spreading everybody, kind of making them all C's. So that was the concept. So instead of having A's and F's and B's and D's and C's, we have all C's. We're going to have all C's, but everybody's going to get a C. That's the thing. It's an average. It's like if you had a class, it doesn't make any difference what grade you got. Everybody was getting a C. C's are 0 to 100, and everybody's getting a C, and we're going to put them all there. That's the concept behind flattening the curve. It was to put more people in the average across the board instead of having a larger spike of people. But the data under the curve, the number of people under the curve in the bell curve versus the flattened curve is the same number of people. So what you're saying there is that we have to have what you're saying is basically we're going to have a certain number of viruses, people that contract the virus. It wasn't meant to eliminate that. It was meant to postpone it. And that's what people are having a problem with, because we postponed it. And now people are getting it because they still have to get it, because there's still going to be an exposure to it. There was no way to eliminate it completely. It just wasn't going to happen, particularly since it was a virus that spreads fairly rapidly. So the idea was to bring the curve down so that at any point in time, the number of people who needed hospitalization would be able to get it. Now, if you think about it a minute, the level of hospitalization, the number of people that require hospitalization is different than the number of people who are going to contract it. So if I looked at that bell curve again, under that bell curve, there was a certain percentage of people that would contract the disease, the virus, and would never require any hospitalization. In fact, in many cases, you may not even know that they had it. So if you think of this bell curve, you think of this bell, think of the area outside the bell. All right. The area outside the bell is the number of people who were either asymptomatic or didn't get it at all. And there's a large amount of people in the calculation, and that number's constantly changed, but there's a large number of people who, for whatever reason, aren't going to get this virus. Some kind of immunity, some sort of maybe just whatever the situation is, the climate, we don't know. But for some reason or another, there's some people that are not going to get it. And it appears that percentage is relatively large. But it may turn out later that area outside the curve was smaller than we thought, because it may turn out with testing later on that some people will have antibodies, meaning that they may have had the virus, but never had any symptoms for it, never had any reaction to it, and fought it off. And in fact, thought that they probably had a cold, which is, there are a lot of coronavirus activity in flu season. That's pretty common. Many kids have that problem. They get a lot of the colds that they get, or a number of them are connected to the coronavirus. They're not coronaviruses. They're not necessarily connected to the COVID-19 coronavirus, but to coronaviruses. So there is some thought that maybe because they're exposed, their immune system is exposed to these things maybe more frequently than adults, that some kids may pick up an immunity may have developed some sort of immunity to the coronavirus, to the COVID-19, just as a result of having built up some antibodies as a result of the normal coronaviruses that hit every year. But anyway, so if we think of it, so the area outside the curve, whether it's flat or bell, are the number of people who will not get it or will not be diagnosed with it. But the area under the curve is the people who will be diagnosed with it, and that's the population of people that will have it. Now, within that population are people who have mild symptoms and never have a problem, don't require any kind of special treatment other than maybe be quarantined so other people don't get it. There are those people under that area who will require medical treatment, may have to go see the doctor, that kind of thing, may have to start taking some sort of prescription or some sort of therapy. And then there are those further people who will get it to the degree that they have to go to the hospital. And those will be the hospitalizations. And then finally, there's a very, very small percentage that represents those people who die from it. Most of those would also be in the population of people who are in the hospital, because typically if you're going to die from it, they go to the hospital first, but not necessarily. Somebody could die from it in a nursing home, could die from it, could get sick and die at home, or contract it to the point that by the time they get to the hospital, they're not admitted for that because it's too late. Anyway, there are some percentages of the people that go to the hospital that won't, some of the people that die, that won't necessarily be recorded in the hospital statistics. But if you look at it, so the area under that curve, flattened or otherwise, is one big number of people who will get it or be diagnosed with it. It may not include everybody that has it, but it will be those people that are diagnosed with it. And then a part of that population are those people that will have to go to the hospital. And we don't really fully, I don't know that we fully know how many people of the people that are diagnosed with it have to go to the hospital, because we don't really know, totally how many people have it. So some people could be asymptomatic and not really be diagnosed with it and go immediately to the hospital because they have some other issue, and it turns out that then they're diagnosed with it in the hospital and could have problems. Now, they may not die from it, they may be discharged, but so it's really hard to determine, if under the curve, the people that are asymptomatic and are diagnosed with it under the curve, how many people there are outside the curve that have it that are never diagnosed with it, or are just people who don't get it and have never had it and won't get it. So, that's what we're struggling with, because we still don't understand the disease. So it's hard to determine what the total number is. But if we start with the overall population and the bell curve, which was what we should have gotten with a normal distribution, and one of the reasons scientists, or I should say statisticians, use the bell curve is because that's typically where data falls. That's how data is normally measured, and it usually comes in a bell curve situation. So typically, if everything else is left alone, you get a large portion of the population that's average, and another portion of the population that's a little above average, and then another portion of the population that's very above average, either on the bad side or the good side. That's how the data falls in a typical bell curve situation, statistic. So it's unusual, for example, that you would get a large percentage of the population that would all fall in the very, very high, and then nobody else, So that's an unusual distribution because there are ranges of everything, and it's true in the virus. There's ranges. We know for a fact there are ranges of reactions and infection of the virus. So we know that there would normally be a wider distribution. If left alone, we would normally get a bell curve distribution, and that's what the scientists were kind of counting on with anything, whether it was this or anything else. They do know that most times there's going to be a varied reaction. And that reaction is normally going to be equally distributed if you don't do anything else. So what they needed to do, because that equal distribution of the bell curve, there are a number of people that would be in the above average and very above average and average that would all contract the virus at the same time. And would in varying degrees, but in, say, more of a symptomatic instead of asymptomatic, more of a problem, and would require hospitalization. And under the bell curve scenario, it is possible that those people requiring hospitalization would be above the level of available hospital beds. In other words, if you drew a line across the top of the bell and you take and cut off the top of the bell where all the C's are, you cut off the top of the bell, it's possible that that's the level of hospitalization, that the hospitals would, and the ventilators and all of that would have been overrun at that level. So the person would have died, not because they died of the virus, but because the virus couldn't be treated appropriately due to too many people getting it all at the same time, and potentially the medical workers having it and not being able to function. So the concept really should have been to flatten the curve, not all the way down, but to flatten the curve to whatever the level was of hospitalization max. So if you imagine that line cutting off the top of the bell, that's where we should have flattened to. Not necessarily all the way down. We didn't need to flatten down so that the total number, the top of the bell, was below the line of hospitalization. We just needed to push down the people that would be hospitalized to the level of hospitalization. So, but what we did instead, what we did is we assumed that every person that got it would have to be hospitalized. And I understand that. I mean, at the time, we didn't know how severe this pandemic was. So at the time, the scientists were saying, well, let's assume that everybody that gets this is going to be hospitalized, and a large portion are going to die. So, and a very large portion are going to have to be on ventilators when they're hospitalized. So that drew big numbers that people were concerned about, big numbers statistically that they had to worry about. Now, we've got better data. We know that not everybody that gets this is going to go to the hospital. In fact, we know that there's a large portion that are asymptomatic. We know that there's going to be that those people under the curve that have got it, that a lot of them will not even experience symptoms and wouldn't know about it if they hadn't been tested. And we know that there are still a large portion of the population under the curve that will require hospitalization, will require ventilators, and may die. Okay. We also know that population that will need hospitalization and that may need ventilators and they may die. We know that percentage of our sample is skewed towards older people. In other words, we know that that's not a normal distribution. So of the area under the curve where we talked about the data being equally distributed, we do know now that that's not necessarily going to be true. If we distributed the data by age, we know that a larger portion of the population that is older has more risk. Okay. Now, you can say also they have more other complications, and that's true. And that's why they always say, well, this is, it affects the elderly and those that have compromised immune systems. Well, yeah, that is true. That's no question about it. And a lot of elderly have compromised immune systems. But if you think about it a minute, it's if it's affecting the older population, uh, more dramatically, that would have put a bigger strain on the system as well, because more of those people are, potentially needing ventilators and and are potentially going to die from it. So, uh, it's not. There are other factors that would cause that distribution, but we do know now that within the curve, with whether we're talking the original curve or the flattened curve, that the data was going to be skewed. It wasn't going to be a pure bell curve. We know that some portion, if you distributed by data, that a larger portion of that population was going to be over 65. And of that population, a very larger population was going to be required hospitalization versus those under 65. We know fewer of those people were going to to get the coronavirus. So that was going to be a smaller number. So it wasn't equally distributed. There was a higher distribution based on age. And we're finding that out now. And it affects statistically what we do. So there's a higher percentage. So now we know to attack this virus, we have to concentrate on age. That's the thing. We have to make sure that the population that we have that can contract it, and that is older and probably has other problems, other immunity issues, that they also have enough hospital beds. So we need to make sure that we have hospital bed availability to cover that. And those patients that do end up being hospitalized, it appears that in many cases it takes much longer. Even if they don't die, it takes much longer. It's once you get to hospitalization, it's an older population and it takes longer. We know with younger, we have fewer people that are even being diagnosed under, so we don't even know fully what that population is, but we know, at least statistically right now, that population is much smaller than the older population that's under the curve. So we didn't have as much problem with that. So initially what we did is assume that the data was equally distributed, and we kind of pushed down on everybody, right? And so we kind of shut off everybody. And in doing that, it's kind of the concept of a balloon with water in it. You know how you kind of squeeze on one end and it all moves to the other end? Well, in effect, that's what we did when we clamped down on the younger population, the schools, and closed the schools down and clamped down on that. We may have, in effect, created a situation where that population would have really been outside the curve, maybe, or would have definitely been above the hospitalization line. And so what we did is we may have forced a situation where, it created more of a risk for some of the elder population. And you say, well, how does that work? Well, what I'm getting at there is that many of the older population do have other types of illnesses, other types of things that need to be treated. They may have diabetes. They may have high blood pressure. They may have heart conditions. They may have lung conditions. They may have, all kinds of different types of things that they were being treated for or needed to be treated for before those things got out of hand. And when we clamped down and stopped some of those services, like the hospitalization services for what we consider to be non-emergency care, whether it was, doctor's appointments and eyes or whatever. And you say, well, how does that have to do it? A lot of problems that older people have are not always identified by a hospital, and don't always, they're identified in other manners, and then you have to follow up. So all of a sudden you go to your dermatologist, or let's take it, so you go to your dermatologist, and your dermatologist in your annual checkup says, you know what, these things might be cancer. let's take a biopsy. And they get the biopsy, and then they say, you know what? This is, you got a little melanoma here. Let's take care of this. Well, if I do that, that's really pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But if all of a sudden I don't go to the dermatologist for, let's say, 4 months, and now I show up at the dermatologist and he looks at it and, first of all, hasn't seen the progression necessarily. And so he doesn't know how fast it's growing. But at the second part of it, even if they immediately go do some and take some action, we have actually crowded that action because we've postponed some of those things. Either the person didn't get it when they needed it, and now it's an emergency. And so now we're dealing with an emergency situation rather than a normal maintenance situation. Maybe it's already cancer at that point. Maybe it's already spread at that point. Now you've got all kinds of issues that were created just because the population of that age didn't get the normal doctors and hospitalizations that they should have gotten. So we will have a larger percentage of that population that will die just because they're at more risk for other things. And we're seeing that happen. And I mean, I know a lot of us probably don't know anybody who has had the coronavirus. In fact, we probably are not even 1 degree away. In other words, we may not know many people who know somebody that had the coronavirus. But I'll bet you right now, somebody who's died of something. I've got a person that worked with me that died of cancer, and I'm convinced that the reason it had happened is that he was, in November or December, he was in his 70s, and in November, I think it was, he came down with shingles. He had a kind of rough case of the shingles, but he got through it all. But in January and February, he was still suffering from what he thought was part of the shingles problem. But he didn't go into the doctor because you really couldn't get in at that point in March. And then finally he went in to the doctor's office, and the doctor said, you've got a problem. Let's look at this, and I'll get back with you with the results. And within a week, they got back with him with the results and told him that he had lymphoma, and they would get back with him in the next week to start the treatment. And they didn't. He died that next Sunday. So was it possible that that would have never been found? And probably. I mean, it might have been already too far along. But I'm convinced that the problem with the coronavirus and COVID-19 was a related factor to his death. Not necessarily caused his death, is obviously lymphoma, but that it was a related cause because he didn't get the treatment that he needed as quickly as he needed it. And I think a lot of that stuff is happening. And some of it is longer term. Some of it is longer term issues. How many people didn't go get colonoscopies that need them? Again, that's something that you don't start getting until you're in your 50s or 60s. So it's not affecting the younger population. So that's what I was getting at, is by clamping down on everyone, we potentially exacerbated the problems that we're going to incur with the older population, because now they're not going to get the coronavirus necessarily, but they also didn't get the care they needed for something else, whether it's COPD or it's heart disease or whatever. That stuff can't be put off. Even dental type stuff. How many times, how most people know dental infections, dental problems cause heart issues. You got to worry about that kind of thing. There's a relationship there. So all of this stuff. So now that we're getting better data, we're starting to see where our problems are. And obviously the problem is with the 65 and over population, and particularly the 70 and over population. And locking them down is not necessarily the answer, because they're now not getting the treatment that they needed. They're not getting the other things that they needed, and actually may be exposed to other things. So anyway, we're seeing numbers now Don't be afraid when you see numbers, because we need those numbers to be up. Because again, the data under the curve is still the same data. It's still the same amount of people. Nobody went away. We didn't avoid it. If you think that the purpose of flattening the curve was to avoid the virus, you're mistaken. You don't understand the math. The math was to delay so that we didn't overburden the hospital. That was the only reason. It had nothing to do with avoiding. It was postponing. It's like the difference between tax avoidance and tax deferral. You know, if I get something that I don't have to pay taxes and I never have to pay it, that's avoiding. That's not what this was about. If, on the other hand, I put money in my IRA account and I don't have to pay tax on it right now, but I have to pay tax on it 10 years from now, that's deferral. So if what I did here is deferral, we took these people who were going to get this problem now, and they're now going to get it 3 or 4 or 5 months from now. The problem so they're still going to get it. The problem that we didn't take into consideration is that they got something else in the interim. We were so focused on the coronavirus that we were not focused on overall health. And that's what irritates me about the statistics and the lack of information that's coming out of CDC and other places. They're focusing on only one illness. Their job is to focus on health. I hate to say it, but the health department is supposed to focus on health. The CDC is diseases, that's for sure. But the health department is supposed to focus on health, and they should be considering overall health, including the health of our seniors who are going to potentially die from other things if we don't do something about it. So when we're talking about opening up and people being tested and the numbers getting higher, keep in mind that is actually a good thing. We need those numbers to be higher because it has to run its course. The people have to get it. It's just the way it works. Statistically, that is what's going to happen. And anyway, so you know, I just kind of wanted to go over the math there because it does make a difference. You know, you need to understand how that works statistically. Most people don't like statistics, but that's the way it works. And so, you know, we have to kind of talk about it. The other thing I say it again is that, you know, we kind of messed up in terms of what we did with the kids. And we still have kids locked down to a large degree. And we still have, you know, the school system locked down. That's a mistake. I mean, we're locking down a percentage of the population that is not at risk, and we're creating situations, which I thought was ironic, is when kids stayed home, it was not the mom and dad necessarily that were taking care of them. Yes, that had an impact. Sometimes the mom and dad had to, but because particularly at the beginning, many of the moms and dads still had to work, you know, and now even they have to work. Who's taking care of them? The grandparents. What group is in the most risk? The grandparents. So all we did is we took the kids that were asymptomatic and probably wouldn't have been impacted by it, and we put them with the grandparents who had the most risk of having that problem and some other problems. So didn't make a lot of sense when you look back. But, you know, hindsight's 20/20. It's easy to be an expert when you're looking back and looking at the numbers after the fact. Statistically going into it, it wasn't that easy. But anyway, so that's your math lesson for this morning, and I hate geometry, so that's the last geometry lesson I think I'm going to do. I appreciate you listening, and hopefully, you got something out of it. Maybe at least leads to some discussion, because going forward, that's what it's all about. It's discussion. So thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 o'clock right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We are Martin County's Heritage Station.